My earliest remembrances of watching videos on YouTube were all about trying to find out what kind of gear certain musicians were using. I want to know what kind of pedals Brad Paisley uses for his guitar tones. I want to know what kind of drums that Tre Cool uses from Green Day. And this pursuit usually leads to you spend a lot of money on a lot of gear, and you realize that it's not exactly the gear that gets you the sound. It's knowing how to use the equipment that you have, and then also just the ability of being able to play those parts. Well, in Match That Mix, my mission is to take this home studio environment, this 11 by 16 extra bedroom in our house with a lot of consumer grade recording equipment, and I want to try and see how close can I get to some of the greats that are out there. In this first video, we're starting with Green Day, American Idiot drums from Tre Cool. At the time of making this video, I'm 33 years old, so really anything late in the 90s, early 2000s, that was my jam. So bands like Coldplay, Green Day, any sort of like pop, punk, rock bands out there, that was the stuff I learned a lot of the instruments that I played today on. When I was taking drum lessons at the music store, I was listening to American Idiot on repeat. Well, I've always wondered, can I get a similar drum tone? Unfortunately, I can't play as fast as I used to, so I had to modify some of the things on that, but we're gonna jump into PreSonus Studio One, which is the software I use to record music at home with, and I've got an actual isolated clip of Tre Cool playing drums on American Idiot. My mission is to see, can I get a similar drum tone from my drum set? So first, let me start off by going through the gear of what I'm actually using in this room. My drum set is a Pearl Forum series, with which I would say is one of the most affordable and old sets that you can get. One of the most important things about a drum set is what kind of heads you are using. On my drum set, I'm mainly using coated Ambassador heads, and I'm using what's called the TuneBot. The TuneBot is essentially like a guitar clip-on tuner, but for your drums. So with the TuneBot, I'm able to set everything at a pretty good tuning, and I've got a preset saved for my own stuff. It's usually about a medium tuning, nothing too high, nothing too low, and I don't have a lot of sustain on my drums. My snare drum is a Pearl Masters maple snare drum. It also has a coated head. My cymbals, I'm using the K Constantinople series. I have a 14-inch hi-hat, and I've got their Crash ride cymbal, which doesn't have much of a bell on it at all. So the cymbals are really nice, and the snare drum is pretty nice. The toms and the kick drum are just kind of meh. But next, the microphones that I'm using on these. I'm using an SM7B from Shure. That's on my snare drum. My two tom mics are Sennheiser clip-on tom mics. My kick drum mic is a Beta 52 from Shure. I have an SM57 underneath my hi-hat pointed straight up at it. I've got an Audio-Technica little pencil condenser microphone underneath my ride cymbal. And then for my room mic, I just happen to have this Neumann TLM 103. This is overkill for a room mic, but I usually have this set up for vocals, so I went ahead and plugged that in, and that is giving me my room sound. It's not contributing much, as we'll see on the recordings to this, but that is my general setup. Preamps, I'm only using the audio interfaces that I have. So the Sapphire Pro 40 is a really old Focusrite 8-channel audio interface, but it has ADAT out. So I'm able to expand my RME Babyface Pro, which is a 2-channel USB interface. I'm able to expand it up to 10 microphone preamps. So most of all of my drum mics are coming from the Sapphire Pro 40, just a basic preamp. And then I'm using channel 1 on my RME Babyface Pro for the TLM 103 that I mentioned earlier. If none of that made sense to you, basically what I want to say is I don't have any external gear. I don't have any compressors. I don't have any EQ. I don't have a fancy microphone preamp. I'm just using the audio interface preamps. So you're going to hear these exactly what drums are supposed to sound like in a room. Now, when it comes to the tracks from Green Day, I can't be 100% sure that these tracks are authentically the drum tracks from Green Day, but they sound about as close as I can imagine them being. If you do a basic YouTube search of any band you're interested in, you'll find Green Day isolated tracks all over the place, or you can type in stuff like Brad Paisley isolated tracks. There's tons of videos out there. you're really just going for, does it sound really good? And for the most part, I've not heard any of these isolated tracks that disappointed me. In today's video, I'll play a little bit of that. I cannot play the full mix version of American Idiot because that will for sure get me demonetized, and it'll probably get me a strike on this channel, which I don't want my channel to be deleted. Best way you can support the channel is hit the subscribe button or the like button, and let me know in the comments section what are some of the influences you've had musically, especially some of the tones that you might want me to chase after here in this home studio. Now we're going to jump into PreSonus Studio One, which is the software I use to record music with. Let's get listening. All right, so here I have a session in PreSonus Studio One. The first thing I did was set the tempo to 186 beats per minute. I loaded the MP3 of American Idiot from Green Day. That's these green tracks down here. Those will stay muted for this video, but essentially I dragged the MP3 into Studio One and I tried to match the MP3 to a click track. It looks like it's definitely on the click, meaning they recorded this song at 186 beats per minute. Then I basically wanted to solo the solo section of the song. Then I've got the drum isolated tracks from Green Day. We can go ahead and take a listen to that. Just so you know, mix-wise, for the sake of YouTube and everything, I do have the Green Day drums track in purple, and I've got it turned down -2. That'll basically keep it from clipping as I'm doing this video here. And then I'm using the level meter plugin just to see how loud these tracks are, because if you have one track louder than the other, I can understand it doesn't seem like a very fair comparison. So the level meter is not changing the audio, it's just letting me know how loud stuff is. So here in purple, here is the drum track isolated from Green Day. Let's take a listen. All right, the first thing, this sounds so compressed, and I mean that in the best way possible. I think these sound epic, these sound really exciting and engaging, and if you've never heard isolated drum tracks from some of these mixes, you should really take a listen to some of your favorite bands out there. Like I said, do a basic YouTube search, Coldplay, whatever your favorite band is, look for the isolated drum tracks, and you'll just hear how processed these things are. A lot of times you can hear something that sounds like an amateur mix because it lacks so much processing. All right, so I'm hearing, and I'll play this again. First of all, the kick drum sounds like something you would associate with some sort of heavy metal. It's very clicky, has a lot of attack, it's very bright, but it's also got this massive low end. I'm hearing a lot of reverb in my headphones, and it's coming from the kick drum as well. Sometimes we just put reverb on the snare drum or the cymbals. This definitely sounds like you got a lot of room and you got a lot of reverb on the kick drum, because the kick drum kind of has that smacky attack sound, and then there's this like mushroom cloud of reverb you kind of hear. The other thing is the snare drum. We're gonna get into this in just a little bit. I can't be for sure that they used samples on this song. It does sound like they're using drum samples. Now that doesn't mean Tre Cool can't play the drums. I'm just saying what I'm listening to when I hear the snare drum, it is so consistent. It doesn't sound like there's any variation in the snare drum. So most people would say that using drum samples, they would supplement, meaning they blend in the snare sample with their live performance. Could be that situation as well. Also, his snare drum sounds to be like it's tuned up a lot higher than what my snare drum is, and we'll get to that in just a second. With all that being said, let's take another listen to the drums. Also, the toms have that same kind of, you're gonna hear this a lot, but the drums have a lot of hyped high end, a lot of low end as well, and it's like the mid-range is just this empty valley, okay? That's gonna make room for a lot of the guitars and bass as well, but let's take another listen to, this is Green Day, Tre Cool, isolated drums. Here it goes. All right, sounds great. Now, one of the things about me playing drums, I mentioned this earlier, I'm 33 years old. I've not been playing any sort of fast 186 beats per minute songs in quite a while. So instead of doing eighth notes on the hi-hat, I chose to do quarter notes and try to be as consistent as I could be. Let's take a listen to the final mix. So I want you to hear what I ended up with. I'm gonna mute the isolated drums from Green Day. Here is what we're working towards, and then I'm gonna break down all the plugins that I used on the track. So here is the finished mix. I think that sounds pretty good. Now, again, this whole Match That Mix series, I'm not gonna say that this sounds just like Tre Cool. I'm not saying that my home studio sounds just like a professional studio, but I wanna ask you a question. Does it sound pretty close? I think it sounds pretty close. Now, I'd love to hear what you think about this in the comments section. One of the things I mentioned earlier, I do think they are using some sort of snare sample. I'm gonna isolate the snare sample that I used using Superior Drummer. Here it is here. I've got a Tama Bell brass drum. This is a 6.5 by 14 inch. If I just give it a click, you can hear what it sounds like. It's just really crispy and a really high-pitched snare drum. That is not what my snare drum sounds like. If I really wanted to just like make my drums sound as close as possible, I would need to turn this up even more. And it makes me a little concerned because my snare drum is tuned up pretty high for its size. I don't know if it'd even be able to make that sort of sound. Here is my snare drum fully mixed, but I just want you to hear how different it sounds than the snare drum, okay? Here it goes. So you can hear my snare drum, it doesn't have as much high-end crack or that really like ringy sound to it. I can put the full drums back in. I'm gonna mute the snare sample. So here is my drum set without the snare sample, just my drums. Still sounds good, it just doesn't sound like the same snare drum. And I would just say that this is where it comes to the gear. If you're really set on having that Green Day like high-pitched snare drum, you probably need to look at getting a similar sized drum with a similar tuning. My snare drum I've been very happy with. It's a maple snare drum and it is pretty versatile. It'll work in different genres and stuff. But that would be something, if you're fighting with it too much, there's almost no amount of EQ that you can put on a snare drum that's gonna make it sound like a higher pitched snare drum, if that makes sense. If you're recording a female vocal and it doesn't sound like Adele, well, not every voice is created the same. Same thing with snare drums. That may come down to a gear independent decision, okay? Let's break down these tracks though. I'm gonna start with the drums bus because all of my tracks, I've got kick, snare, tom 1, tom 2, hi-hat, ride, and room sound. They're all being bussed to my drums bus. On my drums bus, I'm using the UAD native plugin, so you don't have to have their DSP chips to run this stuff, but it's a UAD distressor plugin. And I started with their drums bus preset. So as I hit play on this, you'll be able to see how much compression is happening on that. I've got it set to the nuke setting, so that is a lot of compression happening whenever it does. Nuke is about as high as it goes, and I found that the distressor has that kind of Chris Lord-Alge sound. I believe that Chris Lord-Alge did all this mixing on an SSL console. It has SSL compression, all that kind of stuff. I think if you're going with a plugin looking for that kind of flavor or tone, of course SSL would be great. UAD right now, they only have the native version of the distressor available, and I think the distressor, in a shootout between it and like the 1176, the distressor has closer to that kind of sound going on. So let me hit play on this so you can hear. If I take the compressor off, I turn it back on. It's got this really high-end, clear sound to it. It's compressing a lot, but it's able to maintain that fidelity that you hear, that crispiness in the high end. So I really like the distressor. You'll see that come up many times over. You'll see this kind of EQ move done a lot. I'm just adding a little bit of brightness. I'm adding some more low end on the drums bus. Anytime you're compressing something extreme amounts, like with the distressor, you can follow it up with an EQ. Kind of gives it a little bit of icing on the cake. And then I'm using some more compression. This one is using the PreSonus built-in stock compressor, but it's got a preset called Drums Bus Hard. Let's take a listen to what it sounds like before, and then I'll turn it on. Okay, this one isn't adding as much tone shaping qualities as the Distressor did, but it is ringing in some of those dynamics that are happening. And then I've got a limiter plugin, and really this is just me trying to get a similar volume match to the isolated drum tracks from Green Day. This limiter plugin, typically I wouldn't put it on the drums bus, I would just put it at the export, like the mix bus of my mix. Since I don't have bass guitar and guitars on this session just yet, I just basically put the limiter there. So that way I'm not limiting the Green Day tracks. The Green Day tracks, I want those to be unaffected from plugins, but my drums bus, if I don't have the limiter, it's not gonna sound as loud as the Green Day one, and I want it to be similarly matched. Let's go ahead and hit play on this so you can see how much limiting is happening. It'll be right here where it says reduction. For the most part, we're not seeing any, maybe like half a decibel at some points. There will be some louder sections, like when I'm doing the fill on the snare drum or I'm doing the toms where it may hit -7 as well. That'd be a lot of limiting. But whenever you don't have enough volume, try putting a limiter on there first, maybe to get some more volume squeezed out. That is my drums bus. So literally every single track is being filtered through that. And then let's talk about this reverb stuff. So I have a drum reverb that basically every single one of my drum tracks is being sent to this reverb. And this is where I'm getting that low end reverb sound that I was hearing earlier. So many times with reverb, we roll off all of the low end. So I thought it was really interesting when I'm listening to Green Day's drum mix, again, supposing that this is the real deal, I'm hearing a lot of low end reverb. Typically this gets filtered off where we don't hear any low end on a reverb. So let's take a listen to that. This is the FabFilter reverb plugin. It's got set to about a 2-second reverb time, a little bit of stereo width, not all the way wide. Let me just turn off the reverb so you can hear what it sounds like without, and then I'll turn it on. So this is no reverb. Turn it on. Again, if you take that reverb away, all of a sudden it sounds like we're recording in a bedroom now. So it really gives us almost like an arena sound to it. I really like that. That's one of my takeaways with this whole process. At the top of PreSonus Studio One on any of these buses, I can go up here, click this down arrow, and I want to say store effects chain. I'm going to call this drum reverb Green Day. Give it a description, Tre Cool, Arena, Drums, and click OK. So now in the future, anytime I set up a reverb bus for my drums, I can just click the down arrow or the plus button, whatever, down arrow, and I can go into Drum Reverb Green Day, and it'll load all of my plugins with all of my settings on there. And that's the coolest part of all of this. Now I've got it turned down to about -7. And then on the snare drum, I have a reverb as well. This one is a little bit more filtered. I started with the snare plate preset from FabFilter. You can check out the settings there. It's just a 0.89 second reverb time. So here, without that snare drum reverb, the snare just sounds like it's too clicky and it's gone. So it gives a little bit of ambience to that. Okay, so those are my reverb effects on the drums. Everything else is pretty normal as it goes. The room mic, this is my TLM 103. But just take all of these tracks and take off all the plugins, okay? So here are my drums as recorded. We don't have any processing going on. I've got all the plugins bypassed on the drums bus. Here's what my drums sound like. I'll mute the snare drum as well. Here's what drums sound like. Pretty crazy, right? Now, obviously there's gonna be a volume change, but that was before without any plugins on whatsoever. Let's turn all of our plugins on, and let's turn on our reverbs, and this is after. So let's break these down. On my room mic on every channel as well, I used a Mix Tool plugin. The Mix Tool plugin allows me to turn the gain down after the fact. So I want all my tracks to be around -18. Why -18? I don't really know. But the VU meters for the most part around 0, they're set to -18 as well. It just makes sure all my tracks are at the same volume. So when I load plugins and stuff, especially if I'm gonna be storing this as a preset, I need to have a standard. So if I record drums in the future, I want all my drum tracks to be at -18 when I play them back. So anytime you see the Mix Tool plugin, I'm just making sure I'm hitting -18. On my room track, I've got a compressor loaded where it says drum set, and I've just messed around with the threshold. Let me take a listen to that. It's just compressing every time the snare drum hits. We got a subtle EQ. I'm just kidding. This EQ is egregious. We're rolling off all of this low end. We're taking out some of the mids and we're boosting the highs. So here is my room mic before. Here it is after. It's overtly bright because I'm not using overhead microphones, and one of the things that I'm noticing on Chris Lord Algie's mix is the cymbals are very bright, so I'm getting a lot of my brightness from the room mic. Oftentimes it's going to sound really weird by itself, but nobody is going to listen to my drums other than you. Nobody's going to be listening to my drums in solo on the room mic. They're never going to hear the room mic by itself. It's always in context of the mix, so don't forget that. If something sounds weird in solo, make sure you listen to it in context of the rest of the tracks. Here's my ride cymbal. I don't hit it very much at all, but I am filtering off a lot of low end. Pretty much the only time I hit the ride cymbal there. If I take off this EQ. Okay, so just brightening it up, getting rid of some of the rumble there. Here, the hi-hat, it's going to be a similar move, same kind of EQ, rolling off a lot of the low end, getting some brightness there. I'm using a de-esser plugin. It's very common to use a de-esser plugin on cymbals, things that can be overtly bright or too crispy. Put a de-esser plugin on there. It'll kind of tame those off a little bit. I'll bypass it right now, so this is without any of the de-esser. Turn de-esser on. Kind of subtle, but it is taking away some of those annoying frequencies. Tom 2, the toms are nuts. So cutting out so much low end, okay? So many YouTubers out there are gonna tell you, don't do EQ like this. You know what? I think that people that are using EQ in subtle ways, like I've done this before, I've done this on YouTube videos. You go an EQ plugin and you look at something like this and you visually, you're looking at it and you're thinking, there's no way that sounds good. It just looks like it's mangled all over the place. I want to encourage you to go check out Eric Valentine's YouTube channel. So Eric Valentine, the producer, the guy who's produced things from Third Eye Blind, All American Rejects, Smash Mouth. If you see some of the EQ moves he does on there, I really like the way he EQs because you can tell he acknowledges this is an extreme EQ move, but he's listening to it because there's no way I'm gonna get my toms to sound the way that Green Day's sound unless I'm cutting out some of this mid-range. So let me turn off, I'm gonna go to that toms section, solo it here. I'm gonna turn off the EQ. So this is before, and then I'm gonna turn the EQ on. So this is no EQ right now. I'm gonna turn the EQ on. All right, do you hear how much of that mud got cut out? There's a lot of mid-range missing, but it's about what is the overall picture giving you. I'm hearing a lot of low end, a lot of crispiness, a lot of attack from the sticks. You're not gonna get that on my tom, at least, without doing some major EQ. You notice the same thing pretty much on the rack tom. Just drag and drop these plugins over. Lots of that. Okay, we'll come back to the snare sample in just a little bit. Snare drum, this was a mangled mess because again, I think what I was trying to do to get that same kind of sound that Chris Lord Algie is getting with my snare drum, you start throwing a lot of plugins at it. probably just need to tune your snare drum up higher or use a different snare drum if you really want it that bad. I think the drums sound great even without the snare drum sample, but I've got a gate plugin. The gate is basically gonna mute the microphone whenever I'm not hitting the snare drum. You can take a listen to that. In fact, with the snare drum, let me take off all of the plugins. We'll just start with the Mix Tool plugin. Mix Tool is just adding 2 decibels of gain, nothing crazy there. The next move I had was the gate plugin. So this is before the gate. Turn the gate on. So here it's muting quite a lot of that body from the snare drum. It is opening a lot, so if you wanted to go in here and precisely cut out all those snare hits, that's fine. I don't mind some of the toms and some of the larger hits coming through as well. Then I've got this EQ from FabFilter. Could have used the PreSonus EQ, no difference there. I'm just cutting a lot of low end, so let's turn this, let's go to this section here. I'll set it to a loop. So this is before the EQ. It's after. Not giving a lot of brightness, but it's rolling off a lot of that low end. Here is the distressor plugin. Again, I've got it set to the preset that says big snare and then tweaked some of the parameters, especially the attack time as well. I've got it set to a 10:1 ratio. This is what it sounds like before, and then I'll turn it on. Big volume jump right there. I don't mind that at all. Here is a massive EQ. I'm cutting a lot of low end. I'm cutting a lot of the mids as well, but I'm still getting the low end from the snare drum and then some crispiness on top. Sounds like 2 different snare drums, doesn't it? This is before, this is after. Pretty massive. Another round of EQ. Again, this is the point where I'm starting to think, wow, I'm doing a lot of processing to the snare drum. Probably should just use a different snare drum if I want to get that sound, but here's the before. I've got a compressor plugin called Snare Drum Snap. This is from PreSonus. This is before, after. That's what led me to think that they're probably using a snare sample. When you're using snare samples, a lot of times you can tell it's a sample just because the volume and dynamics, they just never change. It sounds like the same hit all the time. And if you're a human hitting a snare drum, other than like a handful of crazy guys out there, it's gonna be very difficult to hit the snare drum at the exact same spot, at the exact same velocity, which leads me to think that you're using a snare sample, because a snare sample, unless you go in and mess with it, most of the time it's gonna sound so consistent. This is the sample that I'm using. And you hear how that one has a lot of ping, a lot of ring to it. If I take the gaff tape off of my snare drum, that would be another way to get some of the high-end stuff out of there. And then of course they're being sent to my drums bus. But here is my snare sample and my regular snare drum at the same time. By having my real snare drum track mixed in with the snare sample, you're probably thinking like, why not just use the snare sample by itself? Well, if I keep the real snare drum track in there, you hear all the bleed coming from the hi-hat and the other microphones on the drum kit. It makes my snare drum a little bit more believable because it's in context of the rest of what's being hit on the track. Last thing is the kick drum. Here's the kick drum before any processing. All right, so that snare drum at the end doesn't have any of the drums bus processing on it at all. Kick drums don't sound super exciting just fresh off of the microphone. We need to do some processing. So I took off 2 decibels of gain just to get it right at -18. I did another gate plugin. So I want a gate. I want to make sure that it's muting in between hits. So I have a nice clean kick drum. Added some EQ as well. Go ahead and play a little bit of this and then I'll turn the EQ on. Then there's this distortion plugin from PreSonus, adding some grit to it as well. Here's before and then after. I love using that distortion plugin from PreSonus on drums because you're able to add some more of that high-end clickiness without it sounding too fuzzy, I guess. Especially mess with, there's a mix knob on this plugin. This one's at 37%. Have a low mix, so basically just a little bit of distortion is being blended in with the rest of it. Then I've got another instance of UAD distressor. Here's before and then after. Adding a lot of volume there. And here's another one of these subtle quote unquote EQ moves on the EQ. Here's before and then after. All right, last thing I'm gonna share with you is a bounce back and forth between my drums and Tre Cool's drums from Green Day. I've duplicated all of the tracks over here. So what you're gonna see is it will bounce back and forth between Green Day and my drums. I think they sound pretty close. I think this is a successful experiment. I'll be saving all these as my presets later on, especially if I'm going for this kind of rock sound. Again, take a listen, let me know what you think, and feel free to make some suggestions in the comment section if there's certain artists you want me to try to cover in the future. Now here is my drums and Green Day's. I think it turned out pretty good. I mean, I do need to be using the snare sample if I'm gonna get that exact sound of the Green Day drums, but let me know what you think in the comment section. Also, if you got some musical artists or sounds that you've really latched onto, maybe a snare drum sound on a certain recording or a guitar tone from a certain album that you've been listening to, let me know in the comment section and I'll see you for part 2 of this series, Match That Mix. I'll see you next time.